Um, Thank you very much. I wish to thank the directors of Morphomata for having invited me to be a fellow in this session of the fellowships at Morphomata. I had not anticipated that I would be recording this beforehand, so this may sound a little stilted. My apologies already for that. I also, before I start, wish to thank Arina very much for having really helped me understand how Zoom works and how I should go about doing this lecture. Since this is a pre-recorded version, I will refrain from making too many prefatory remarks, as those can be done as part of the discussion either today or tomorrow in the fellows meeting. When I had sent I just need to make a small clarification, which is when I had sent out the brief abstract for and title for my lecture this time, I had wanted to bring together some of my ongoing work on photography and painting alongside another interest of mine, which is on public art and public political protest art. And this is why the title was given as Visual Culture and Politics, Revisiting a Relationship in an Era of Public Art Debates. Now, I must apologize that this paper doesn't actually address many of the public art debates, but it does try and bring some of the concerns from my earlier work and ongoing work on particularly photography. I'm trying to put it in conversation with a very small body of public political protest art. So let me just begin then. The relationship between art and politics is complex, often fraught, and cannot always be understood using frames that are anchored by conventional art historical or theoretical analysis. In Rancier's words, art is a work on the distribution of the sensible, in that what we think of as perception is rearranged between what we see, think, and understand, and that which we do not. This paper is part of a book project and started as an attempt to answer what appears to be an innocuous and simple question. How does one understand Indian women's artistic production? In time, the attempt to grapple with this question expanded the purview of the research, as the question about gender was constantly being disturbed and rearranged by cultural texts produced by artists whose self-identified positionality, queer or lower caste, was anchored differently. Like the work by certain kinds of women artists, the cultural interventions by Dalit is the term that's used for the erstwhile untouchable community in India, and queer artists, the cultural interventions by Dalit and queer artists disturb stock expectations of art as also the task of the artist. Given the difficult and complex relationship that art, politics, and theory have with each other, this study works with the premise that art and critical writing on it are best read as sites of struggle where definitive opinions are at best a distraction, at worst a hindrance. It is this, I would suggest, that can avert the problems alerted in an early and rather powerful warning by art historian Linda Nochlin, who argued that, and I quote her here, the problem lies not so much with some feminist concept of what femininity is, but rather with their misconception, shared with the public at large, of what art is. The making of art involves a self-consistent language of form, more or less dependent upon or free from, given temporally defined conventions, schemata, or systems of notation, which have to be learned or worked out either through teaching, apprenticeship, or a long period of individual experimentation. That was Linda Nochlin. in 1988. This, to my mind, is an enduring problem while thinking of the work of art, where tendentious theoretical or critical reading ends up eclipsing the kinds of spaces of openness and possibility in interpretation that artists themselves would demand. Here, the challenge is to think of how social origin, class, caste, gender, or community origin, and artistic journey, both educational and experimentations with form, might inflect the manner in which one understands the artist and her work of art. This is especially relevant as the work of artists from marginal communities, while often addressing their location or identity, does not necessarily translate into predictable visual forms that necessarily chronicle either deprivation or resistance, though sometimes it might. While the bulk of my work until now has been on painting and photography, as I said when I started, I have been tracking another dimension for almost a decade now, that of art produced as part of political movements. This usually takes different though related forms and can be wall or street painting, and sometimes it's literally on the road that we walk upon, posters, stencils on buildings or walls, and occasionally graffiti. For the purposes of this paper, I shall bring two different bodies of work together, one by three very well-known photographers, Indian photographers, and the other of wall art from my university, the Jawaharlal Nehru University, to examine what these may suggest to us about portraiture, as also about the relationship between art, ideas, and the political. Now, just a few brief remarks about portraiture itself, since the larger discussion that's going on as part of this fellowship period is on biography and portraiture. The past decades have witnessed complex theoretical discussions about photography and images. This brief paper cannot do justice to the range and scope of these, nor is that its purpose. Therefore, in the first part of the paper, I wish to think about the photographic image in order to think about its relation to intimacy, ethicality, and the political. My interest here, triggered by the formidable oeuvre of the three photographers that I'm looking at, is to think about the possible statuses of the photograph that it could possibly have. And some of the kinds of terms that I'm using, be it intimacy, ethicality, or politics, are categories that come up when these photographers discuss their own work. So in many ways, this is an attempt to get beyond some of the concerns that have dogged discussions on photography, the persistent, almost anxious concern about the indexical and the real, the tension between the shown and the seen, or the photographer and the spectator, and the tendency to create a taxonomy of photographs according to genres, documentary, landscape, portrait, and so on. Sunil Gupta, who's one of the photographers whose work I'm looking at here, while reviewing 4 decades of his work last year, says that he's a child of the 70s, where everything from love, friendship, to illness was both personal and political. His work, like that of the other two photographers under review here, Sudharak Olve and Shiba Chachi, is genre-defying simply because of the work the photographs do, as Azule had recently reminded us that we do need to think about not just what it means, but what the photograph might do. And this is very similar to the kinds of ways in which, say, art critic and thinker W.J.T. Mitchell and his suggestive writing, all the way from his early work, Iconology, to his much later work, examine the polysemy of images by looking at the relationship between the mind, language, figural usages, amongst others, to think about the ways in which meaning is signified. Significantly, images of the same thing, whether these have physical attributes or not, for instance, grief or a tree or something, are never configured similarly across different media. This lack of congruence is, to my mind, an invitation to think of the multivalent nature and signification of images. In other words, a portrait can become an invitation to think beyond its referent and indeed the indexical, as we know Barthes did famously in his last work, Camera Lucida, or Bazin in his moving and suggestive piece on photography and affect. And this makes possible other ways of seeing and spectation. Concerns about fixity of meaning are not restricted only to readings of photographic portraiture. Irene J. Winter, in her suggestive essay on royal portraiture in the ancient world, makes a strong argument for the polysemy of portraiture. The portrait, as she argues, is a three-way relationship between image, identifiable referent, and meaning. By considering when an image was intended to function as a portrait, then, we are pressed further to grapple with the larger questions of the presentation and representation of known historical figures that bring the Mesopotamian sculptures not just into the survey texts, but into the discourses of art history. This is what Irene Winter says. So what she's doing is denaturalizing the relationship between the referent and the image. So the question that she's therefore asking is, when is a particular historical individual portrayed as a king? Not, is that a portrait of ex-king? Winter's argument opens up ways in which one may think of portrayal. Photographic portraiture, with its relationship to, in Winter's words, an identifiable referent, can, with the more affective readings made possible by Barthes or Bazin, be extended to signify something that isn't simply mimetic. Indeed, one may, to the what or when of the portrait, add an additional query. What is the portrait of? Here I find Candace Keller's work on Malian portraiture and her use of the indigenous Malian idea of dibi, which literally, as she says, translates as darkness and obscurity and is directly aligned with ambiguity, very suggestive. Such an idea, which is opposed to what she says they term as jaya, which means clarity, also finds productive place in her thinking. And this offers us, the idea of dibi or ambiguity, offers us immense possibilities for thinking about formal attributes of portrait-based photography, but it also helps in opening up ways of reading its effects and affective properties. So to start with the first photographer whose work I wish to share with you, that of Sunil Gupta. Now what I've done is I've chosen a photo each from 3 different bodies of work. He's been, he has a oeuvre that extends over 4 decades. And if you actually go to his website, you can see a large part of that work, though not all of it is there. The first, and let me now try and share something with you here. This is Sunil Gupta. The first of these pictures, which I want to show you here, is from a series of street pictures he shot standing at the corner of Christopher Street in New York City in 1976. As many know, this is also the site of the iconic Stonewall Inn. And for Gupta, who had come out as a gay man a while before, this was exciting for any numbers of reasons, including what would be an abiding refrain in all his work of how to think about gay visibility and gay publics. The second photograph is from a series called Exiles and was shot in Delhi and in the 1980s. Gupta had returned for the first time to the city of his birth, having immigrated to Canada with his family in the 1960s, and was keen to continue with his interest in documenting gay lives, this time in India. He found that there was no language around gayness, just, as he calls it, a lot of sex, no talk. So the challenge that this posed for him was, again, I quote him here, trying to make a visual solution around something that wanted to be invisible. We will see this refrain around invisibility once again when we look at Sudharak Ulve's work, Gali, where the subjects wish to be invisible. And so I will come back to this theme again. Now, Exiles is a series which is enacted, even though the quotes he uses to frame the photographs are what he calls real. And in this particular photograph, the man who is standing with his back to us is saying that you are so lucky because you in the West have gay bars and gay liberation, and you have a very different kind of life. And this is the quotation, the caption that he's using to frame this photograph with. Now, what Exiles is doing, so unlike Christopher Street, which just seems to have streams of gay folk walking, though often you might see in those pictures that some are looking quizzically at this young man on the corner with a camera, Exiles deliberately places gay men in well-known public places in Delhi in order to make visible the pain and confusion of lives lived in obscurity. The last is from the series From Here to Eternity, a body of work that was made after Gupta was detected with AIDS. Thinking back about that time, from the middle of the present coronavirus or COVID pandemic, I'm reminded of the wreckage that AIDS continues to cause in many parts of the world, taking lives, scarring relationships, and leaving behind endless trauma. In this series, the photographs are diptychs, where Gupta juxtaposes his own body, taking pictures through an HIV lens, is what he calls this, with that of a bar or a nightclub that had been part of his beat. In his book Queer, which came out a few years back, many of these photographs were to be included in chapters that were a meditation on medicalized living, death, and loss. Sunil Gupta is not merely an illustrious photographer of our times. He's also someone who continually reflects on his politics, identity, and indeed aesthetic choices as an Indian gay man. Gupta's documentation is deeply linked to his reflection on his politics. Indeed, this underscores his need to make public and record the hidden life of gay people rendered invisible in the daily rhythms of straight society. The indexical and the evidentiary then takes on a different meaning altogether, as indeed does the portrait of the back of a man who must remain invisible. It is no longer debilitating, the undoing of the photographic aesthetic, but can be seen as a deeply moving accomplice of the political. The second photographer whose work I want to share with you here is Sudharak Olve. Now, the photographs here are from two bodies of Olve's social documentary work, one on scavenging and the other of sex workers in the red light area of Bombay in a place called Kamatipura, street number 11. In a small text accompanying his photographs in the series known as Gully or Street, Olve says, and I quote him here, about 30,000 conservancy workers, also known as sweepers, are employed by the Greater Bombay Municipal Corporation. These workers collect the city's garbage, sweep the streets, clean the gutters, load and unload garbage trucks, and work in the dumping grounds. All 30,000 of them are Dalits, belonging to the lowest rung of the Indian caste system. They have little or no education. Without exception, all of them despise their work. They are either completely ignored or looked upon with disgust by the rest of society. They have to work in the midst of filth with no protective gear, not even access to water for washing off the slime. Most of them are alcoholics and live in poverty in dismal housing. They're perpetually in debt despite earning what, by Indian standards, is a decent wage of US dollars 152 per month. The workers abuse their wives and children, and when the husbands die, usually at a young age, the despised job passes to the widows. The despair continues. Few years ago, quite by accident, I descended into the living hell, a phrase which quite accurately describes the life of these workers. What I saw shook me to the core of my being, that thousands of men and women are living and working in such dehumanizing conditions filled me with rage and shame. So this is Olve introducing us to why he actually wanted to why he wanted to make this series on Gully. And in another interview, he speaks about how these sweepers and cleaners who are cleaning garbage day in and day out and literally stink of it all the time and cannot even ride on the bus because people sitting there do not want people who are stinking riding on the bus with them, speak about themselves as garbage, as kachra. They say, we pick up kachra, we are kachra. Always sees his work as that of someone bearing witness. To the invisible, inhuman, stigmatized labor undertaken by these workers to make Bombay, like other Indian cities and towns, habitable for everyone else. Research in labor studies has made great strides in the past decades. Much of the work from the 1970s onwards, both international and Indian, has critiqued understandings that have seen labor processes as a consequence of the inexorable unfolding of a capitalist rationality working on a passive workforce. So there's been a huge critique of that kind of understanding, and have factored in, other than differentiation on grounds of gender, race, or class, notions like the agency of labor, social relations that govern its organization, and the ideological, political, and state apparatus that regulates production relations. And in many ways, this is taking on and developing certain strands of concerns that were live within Marxist theorizations of labor, namely the lives and conditions of the working poor, the question of consciousness, and the histories of resistance. However, the problem arises when one is faced with caste-based labor that is rooted in a history of violence, exclusion, humiliation, and stigma. Feminist scholar Anupama Rao, in a very suggestive essay on Dalit Marxism, occasioned by the making and screening of filmmaker Anand Patwardhan's Jai Bhim Comrade, explores the ways in which Dalit subjectivity and politics has been shaped by the difference and relationship between caste as labor and caste as identity. She argues that Ambedkar, Dalit thinker and one of the key architects of the Indian Constitution, found that while thinking about the relationship between caste and class, and I'm quoting her here, stigma and labor were supplemental, yet incommensurable categories. The struggle for Ambedkar was with specifying caste and untouchability as a peculiar kind of body history. Ambedkar addressed this complex and elusive form of dehumanization by taking recourse to terms such as class and labor, but always to forefront the difference of caste and the specificity of its social experience. This is how Anupama Rao analyzes Ambedkar's thinking about caste and caste's relationship to a bodily history and caste's relationship to stigma. The centrality of the body and of biological metaphors, as she argues, have been formative in caste ideology, drawing as it does upon notions like defilement, touch, stigma, and so on. Historically, touch is both bodily reality and a metaphor for regulating both social space and ritual hierarchy. Please don't come, I'm recording my lecture. Please don't do this. Sorry. Ideas like purity or pollution hinged on what Aniket Zaure calls the phenomenology of touch, where contact is both the form and content of the touch and gives reality to it. Zaure has pointed out that touch is a sensation that cannot be stopped, hence the vulnerability of a body to torture, for instance. Needless to say, in the Indian historical context, touch acquires a strangely paradoxical status of marking the borders of social contact, the polluted, untouchable, which were forever breached by the routinized sexual violation of lower caste Dalit women by upper caste men. Ambedkar's insistence on the specificity of the social experience of caste as stigmatized and dehumanized, then poses a serious challenge to the radical possibilities that a Marxist theory of labor possessed. In essence, Marx's labor theory of value worked on the assumption that the actual value of a commodity is produced by labor power, and that it's actually surplus value, which is, the essence of capitalist profits, which is the asymmetry between wages, the hours that are worked, and the cost of commodities. So, in other words, for Marx, capital or the national economy was not a thing, but a social relation between persons mediated through things. Its ultimate transformation would be possible only with class consciousness, often shortened to a working definition of the shift from a class in itself to a class for itself, and so on and so forth. Now, the problem, however, is that the conditions of labor and life of stigmatized, incasted labor like manual scavenging and cleaning hinge on a hatred of the work involved, an experience of trauma and humiliation, and a desire to distance, if not oneself, at least the next generation, from such labor. Always photographic bearing witness then forces us to encounter that which most upper caste, middle class people wish to avoid, Indians that is. The other side of the desire for clean cities is that its cleaners must remain invisible, or they do actually remain mainly invisible, if not physically, then certainly socially. This is part of a lived reality for many of us. Always Gully forces us to encounter the question of visibility once again. Which laboring bodies and what kinds of labor are visible? Always Photographs witness the trauma and consequences of the violence of such work. They also remind us that certain kinds of labor need not be dignifying. In returning Dalit castes in modern India to older forms of traditional caste work, the state reveals a deeply flawed notion of citizenship. That a substantial number of Indians can be unaware of this reminds us of what Dalit activists, including Deswara Wilson, have repeatedly said. Only upper caste can afford to forget caste. Dalits live with it as a daily reminder. And these two are from Gully. These are pictures of some of the workers. Always speaks extremely movingly about how he had to work with them to earn their trust and to finally get their permission that they did not mind his photographing them, or at least they could somehow try and live with it. In Kamatipura, the second series of photographs here, always invokes the savage and disturbing reminder that Namdev Dhasal, the Dalit poet who grew up in this area of Bombay, left behind in his Golpita poems. Always says, and I quote him here, "Many years were to pass, many lessons had to be learned before I entered Namdev's world. What I saw wasn't Kamatipura of the early 1970s when Namdev had written the Golpita poems. Since then, many things had changed. The cages were gone, work on social empowerment was underway, HIV had entered, globalization was taking its toll, the people had been uprooted, even the physical landscape had undergone change. It took me months and years before I had the courage to take my camera out of my backpack. Not only because I was sure it would get smashed, and quite rightly so, but also because I had to first earn the right to see." And I will stop the discussion on all the way there. We can go back to that later. The third photographer whose work I wish to share here with you is that of feminist photographer Shiva Chachi. Now, the photographs that I have chosen here are from her series, 7 Lives and a Dream. Here she juxtaposes photographs that she had taken during the women's protests of the late 70s and early 80s with what she calls staged photographs of 7 of these women. The staging was done in the early 90s, which involved her inviting the women to choose their own modes of self-presentation. She says that, and I quote her here, "The difference between the photographs made in the 80s and the staged photographs of the early 90s is not that some are activists and others are not, The differences between documentary images and staged constructed portraits, both are feminist activists. So what she wanted to do in the stage photographs was to, as she calls it, alter the balance of power somewhat between the photographer and the photographed. And while the earlier photographs were taken in the midst of the many protests that marked the early phase of the urban women's movement, the ones here were at the many anti-dowry protests in Delhi. There was a period from the late 70s to the 80s, it continues even now, but there was this huge sort of, hundreds of young women who were married and the families had not been able to provide the sufficient amount of dowry necessary, were very often killed, most often burned to death. So most of these protests were against those dowry murders. And Chachi says that she herself was photographing, recording, campaigning, shouting slogans, all at once at that time. And by the 90s, when she's looking at these women activists from the 80s and allowing them or inviting them to construct their own selves visually, she is beginning to think about them differently. Both Shah Jahan Appa and Satya Rani were mothers whose daughters had been victims of dowry murders. This photograph of Satya Rani and this photograph of Shah Jahan Appa are from the 1980s protests. And their daughters had been victims of dowry murders. Their politicization and involvement in the women's movement began with their own trauma and sense of loss. Many of the early protests were in localities where these horrific murders happened, but were not restricted to these spaces. Delhi then, unlike now, was not locked down by Section 144 of the Criminal Procedure Code that disallows what is termed as unlawful assembly, which is actually even a small group of people, in any number larger than 4 can be called an unlawful assembly, and you can be picked up for that. This meant that women protesters held rallies, marches, and meetings in different parts of the city and routinely picketed police stations. In the anti-dowry protests, women often came with photographs of their murdered daughters, some of whom, as in the case of Satya Rani's daughter, were graduates. And here you can see Satya Rani holding up a picture of her daughter as she protested. Graduating from university was no mean feat for a young woman from a lower middle class or working class family, and would have involved huge sacrifices by her family. In remembering her and in their fight for justice, the grieving mothers retrieved photographs that showed their daughters as single and educated, with the possibility of a different life and future. In the stage photographs, Satya Rani sits on the steps of the Supreme Court of India, her daughter's sari slipping down the steps, only to be held there by the many files that she carries each day as she trudges to court to fight for justice. Her daughter's photograph stands to one side, garlanded, as is often the case with photos of the dead amongst the Hindus in India. She herself seems tired and resigned, so unlike her fiery self that was seen raising slogans a decade ago. Shah Jahan Appa holds her daughter's burqa in her hands, framed by the trophies she won when young. These, at the back are the trophies that her daughter had won. At her feet are pictures of her own past self, that are these. Seen in different protests, pickets, and marches. Each enactment is an invitation to us to understand the ways in which feminist activists made sense of their own selves via loss, memory, and a desire to continue resisting, however painful or exhausting the process may be. Seen together, each set of photographs is a reminder of a phase of the women's movement. So if we see these together, that brought women across class and religious community together finding common cause at least in certain moments of protest. Feminist mobilizations spread across a wide political spectrum, with the women's wings of different political parties engaging some of the central concerns of that period, particularly dowry murders. Yet most of the women, like Satyarani and Shahjahan Appa, were drawn to the autonomous women's movement that was as yet in its nascent phase, and thus possessed the ability to be shaped by those who became involved in it. Unlike gay lives, which were invisible at that time, 1980s feminism made the ordinary Indian women's politicization visible, which is what was captured so poignantly by Sheba Chachi's portraits. Yet Chachi herself says that her desire for the staged photograph, which she was to do a decade later, was to both move away from her own earlier work, which had become a stereotype of protest photography when others replicated her form, and to think about how she could photograph women as citizens. So in inviting the 7 lives that she documents here, she actually stages here alongside with them, what she does is to actually ask them how they want to stage this, how do they want to actually make a statement about their own self, their own portrait as citizens, as activists. Queer, Dalit, or woman. None amongst these embody Indian citizenship with any sense of entitlement, whatever the formal provisions of the Indian Constitution might be. Moving in and out of the line of sight, rendering the meanings of both visibility and invisibility ambiguous, these portraits of different kinds of body histories force us to encounter the different ways in which love, loss, work, resistance, or degenerating bodies might be lived, imagined, and imaged. The LGBTQ, the women's and Dalit movements have all hinged on a critique as indeed a recrafting of the social. Yet in each, the social itself shifts, demanding a recognition by political movements of differing axes of power and often a great dissonance in histories of resistance. Both Gupta's and Chachi's images remind us of the ways in which the LGBTQ and women's movements reimagine both friendship and kinship differently, even as these were accompanied by trenchant attacks on patriarchy and heteronormativity. The new spaces of difference engendered not merely a more supportive sociality, they also mark the making of a new political. But when one places always images of ethical witnessing alongside, it forces us to remember that caste violence is the fault line that challenges even such transformatory politics. In the distribution of the sensible, this is the supplement that is rarely visible or understood. Now, in the last part, and a very brief part of this paper, I want to move away from portrait photography to the political wall art in my campus, in the Jawaharlal Nehru University campus. Now, much of JNU's 50-year-old history, and perhaps I should just start the much of JNU's 50-year-old history has involved an intimate relationship between pedagogy and politics, both of which are continually unlearned and recrafted. Here, briefly, I want to explore the ways in which Eduardo Galeano's famous words, "The walls are the publishers of the poor," come to life. And perhaps it may be just good to look at these images. All right. Wall art in JNU has been intensely political, even as it has probably been a far better indicator of students' engagements with what they read, think, and argue about than any term paper that is routinely handed into their departments. Wall art in JNU is a testimony to its having always been a highly political campus, with a continued dominance of its politics by students on the left and far left. In more recent years, however, Dalit political formations and sometimes the students' wings of the two major national parties, the Congress and the BJP, have competed for wall space. The few images I have chosen here while reflecting this shifting political trend are also about the ways in which JNU's campus's wall art, its preferred form for articulating political positions or intervening in ongoing debates, is through a use of portraiture. And perhaps we can look at this once again. So we have Marx and Lenin and Bhagat Singh, we have Che Guevara, we have Birsa Munda, Jyotiba and Savitribai Phule, Ambedkar, Bhagat Singh again, Rohit Vemula, about whom I will speak some more, and the Ambedkarite slogan, Jai Bhim, which was painted on the administrative block's wall last year during the anti-fee hike protests. The many faces one encounters on its walls, from Marx and Lenin, Che, to Indian political figures and thinkers like Birsa Munda, Jyotirao and Savitribai Phule, Ambedkar or Bhagat Singh, have all signified the ways in which students both name themselves into existence as political actors and thinkers in their own right, but also to express their ongoing dialogic relationship with bodies of thought that are exemplified by the images on the wall. These are portraits of books they've read, thought that they have engaged with, actions they have been inspired by. With Rohit Vemula's portrait, we enter a new phase of political wall portraiture where the person painted was a young Dalit student from Hyderabad Central University, a very political student, who took his own life as an act of protest against his campuses and the country's entrenched caste violence. Rohit's death in January 2016, recategorized as institutional murder by students all over the country, galvanized an entire generation of student activists, making anti-caste protests central to campus politics everywhere. Alongside Jai Bhim, the Ambedkarite slogan, and an alternative to the Red Salute, has now become a clarion cry for an entire generation of protesters whose political interventions demanded visibility and redress from the Indian society and Indian state for caste violence. JNU's wall portraits are then both a portrait of a political campus, but also, taken in its entirety, a portrayal of some of the most significant ways in which Indian politics has changed and evolved. JNU's walls have been stripped repeatedly of its wall art, and in fact, at the current moment, there are no posters or art, or they're just very tiny bits that you can actually see on the wall, because most of it has been taken down by the administration, which is actually afraid of student politics and their capacity for educated dissent. Writing at a time when the Indian state, and that is at this very minute, represented by the ultra-right-wing Hindu Nationalist Party, the BJP, is cracking down with impunity against political dissent, arresting and jailing student and human rights activists. I wish to think that JNU's student protester, holding a book aloft, forever speaking truth to power, will remain our emblem and our lasting inspiration. And what the police are saying is, they've got a book, they've got a book. And what the students are saying is, oppression is your privilege, protest is our right. So perhaps I will end this talk now. Thank you very much. I'm so very sorry for all the technical glitches. I hope this comes through properly and we can have a profitable discussion. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot.